right, welcome back guys. Welcome back to part 2 of this series where we are going to build a URL shortener in Go. Now, as discussed before, URL shorteners are not really that complicated. They're actually quite simple systems, but the idea of building a URL shortener and deploying it in Go is to go through the whole development cycle of developing your own app in Go, developing your own HTTP server, and so on. So I think it's going to be a very good kind of like an experience for you to have, especially deploying it and making sure that everything works. Now, in this part 2, we're going to actually build a very basic, simple HTTP server and going to get it up and running. We're going to accept GET requests and POST requests. That's kind of the scope of this lecture. So let's get started. Now, before we do anything, the first thing I need you to do is to basically confirm the version of Go that you have installed on your machine. Now, there's a couple of features we're going to use out of Go that are only available in version 1.22 plus. Right now, I think at the time of recording, the latest version is 1.2.1224. Now, you want to make sure that you do have 1.22 at least. Now, this is very important. Otherwise, the following stuff is just simply not going to work for you. Now, I'm going to start this from the very start. I'm going to make a folder called Go Shorter, and yes, that is the name of our application. We are going to go shorter. So let's do that. We're going to make a folder called Go Shorter. I'm going to go into that folder, and then the very first basic stuff to do with the Go application is to go basically mod init. Now this mod init is basically going to initialize the whole module, the whole package as MSMO/Go Shorter, and then that will give me a Go mod. So let me just show you what happens there. So here we have the name of the module, which is the name of the package for us, which is MSMO/Go Shorter, and we also have the version of Go. And that's why I'm saying it's extremely important that you get the version right. Otherwise, you won't get the routing stuff that we're going to do a little bit later. Cool. Once you have that, we're going to make a file called main.go. I will open the whole folder in Helix, and I'm going to navigate to main.go. Now, obviously, this is the entry file to our package. I am going to have basically just the package here, package main, and then I'm going to make a function called main, and this is going to be the main function that is going to run for our app. Cool. Let's just save that, and then we can start. Now, what we want to do is basically run a server. Currently, with version 1.22, the server, the net HTTP module, which is built into Go, now is powerful enough for you to have sophisticated routing, and you can run your own server. At this point, there is kind of no way for you to use like a framework for Go at this point, specifically for a project like the one we are doing here, where the scope is really simple. So I will show you how to just run basic HTTP server with the Go standard library itself. Now, in the Go standard library, we have this idea of a multiplexer for a server. So what we're going to do is going to make a multiplexer and then attach that multiplexer to the server. If you come from a different language background, whether it's like Node or PHP or whatever it is, a multiplexer in this case is basically just a router. So I'm going to initialize it that way. So a router in this case is going to be HTTP. So I'm going to import the module, and it's going to be new serve mux. And this is just the multiplexer as I mentioned. It's going to basically initiate a Go routine for every single request. That's going to handle it properly. So that's what it is under the hood, but you can think about it as the router. Cool. Now this router will give us a way to handle different routes basically, and we're going to do that with the handle function. So what this basically says is if you get a request at this pattern, if the request matches this pattern, then trigger this function that is going to handle that request. Again, that's why I'm calling it a router in this case. So in the way you write this this pattern is basically the verb first. And again, this is the new part for 1.22. So make sure that you have 22 installed. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to say if we get a get request at /, which is basically at the root, I'm going to handle this with this following function. And this following function is not going to do much. We're going to just send back a hello world. So let's do that. Now, it's important to understand that Go language is just basically a low-level programming language. And because it's a low-level programming language, you will feel a lot of times that you are actually very close to the protocols, very close to the memory and so on. And that's really, really fantastic. But it does mean that the way you do things has to be slightly different if you come from a more high-level language like I do, maybe from TypeScript background and Python background. Now, that being said, right here we have two kind of like variables for this function here. We have W, which is going to be the writer, right? And this is the response writer. And you can actually think about the response writer is that it's going to send back response to the client, but it's actually just writing on top of the HTTP protocol. If you, I don't know if you have background on this or not, but basically what happens when your client sends a request, the request gets serialized and strings into bytes basically, and those bytes transfer all the way through the protocol to the server, and the server will receive them as bytes and is going to respond back as bytes and so on. And that's what happens on the protocol itself. This is hypertext transfer protocol, so we are just sending bytes back and forth, and that's how it works. So that's how it works in general everywhere, but Go will actually ask you to do things low level. If you use a framework, maybe things will be a little bit different, but now we're just sticking to standard Go. Now what that means basically is that if I want to respond back to the client, I'm going to write something. And this again, this write something is sending back the data into the open connection. And if you see here that this function will have to take a slice of bytes. As I mentioned earlier, in HTTP connection, we are sending bytes back and forth and they get serialized and so on. So what I'm going to do, I want to send some kind of a string. So I'm going to basically convert the whatever strings I put here into a byte, and I'm going to send that back. So let's just do this hello world here. And this is just a very simple route that's going to respond back with a hello world. Cool. Just to recap, this basically says when the router gets a request at root, get/root, a get request /root, we're going to trigger this function, and this function will not do much, but it's just going to write back hello world. Cool. So that's the first thing. This is, we have our router now. Now we need some server to attach this router to. So let's do that. So server is going to be http.server, basically server. Yep, this is it. And this is just going to define different parameters for the server. And we are going to basically say that the address of this server is going to be port 3000. So we are listening on port 3000. And then we are going to say that we are going to pass a handler to the server. So every request that gets received by the server is going to be pushed to the handler, and the handler will do things on its own. And then finally, what I'm going to do, I'm actually just going to print, just to make sure that everything is a bit more clear. So I'm going to say we are now listening on a port 3000. And then finally, the server, all I need to do now is just listen and serve. This is basically it. So this is just like, how many lines is that? Like maybe 10 lines of code? I'm guessing it's around 10 lines. Yep. Yeah. So these lines of code are just the very, very essential basics for you to run an HTTP server in Go. We haven't done much special. This is just extremely simple. So let's actually test that. I'm just going to make this a little bit shorter, and then I'm going to go to shorter project. Here we go. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to basically, let's try that again. Yeah. What I'm going to do here is basically just run this. So I'm going to go run main. So when I run this, what will happen is that now we just get that print line that we have there, which is basically says that we are now listening on port 3000. On a different terminal, I'm just going to curl, basically just curl a request to HTTP 3000. And what I'm expecting after I send this request is that I should simply just get back a hello world message from the server. That's exactly what happens. So again, this is really, really basic and very simple. Cool. So now we have managed to handle a GET request. The second part that I want to show you as well in this video is just handle a POST request as well. So now, as I mentioned earlier, with Go 122, you can actually specify basically the route this way. So instead of just adding that the method here is going to be get, I'm going to specify that this is going to handle POST requests. And then remember from the previous video, this is just one of the other routes that we're going to have in here. And this is going to be handled with the separate functions right there. Cool. Now we can actually just separate this for a little bit of visual clarity. Now let's just talk about how we're going to handle POST requests in Go and in this application as well. Now, when we plan to make a POST request from the client, we are planning to make a request with a JSON body, basically. So that's going to be a JSON object that we have on the client, wherever that is, and then we're going to send it. Now, remember what I said earlier about Go being a low-level language and that we are very close to the protocol. What actually happens in the background is that this JSON object that we were just talking about, it will get serialized into bytes and will get sent to the server. And in fact, this is what we are going to receive here is basically just those serialized, those bytes, basically. And that's why we are going to need to decode those bytes onto a JSON. Now, the way you do this in Go is basically you need to first of all say like, here is what I'm expecting to come from that request. And the way you do that is basically with a struct. So I'm going to do that. So let's just call this shorter request here. And this is going to be a struct. And keep this in mind, what I'm doing here is basically saying to Go, I am going to expect some data coming from the client. And the first thing that I do is basically I'm going to define what data I'm expecting here. So I'm expecting a URL, and this URL is going to be type of string. I'm also expecting a tag, and this is going to be another string as well. So again, this is very simple. This is basically just saying to Go, you know, like this is shape of like an object that expect the shape in memory when I try to ask for it. And this is just us saying the first thing we need to do is basically this data that will come from the client. Here is how it's gonna look like. Now, what I'm going to do after this is I'm gonna like literally initiate one value of the shorter request. So I'm going to say here, let's just see, request data here. Request data is going to be an empty shorter request struct. So this is what this is. I can see a typo here. Let me just fix this real quick. So this is called shorter request. That's correct. Let's just go there, bn. This is going to be called shorter request. Beautiful. So what I did with that line is basically just initialize an empty structure of shorter request in the memory. And this is empty now. There's nothing there, but I'm just kind of like preparing to receive data onto this space in memory that I have kind of like initiated. Now, after I do this, what I can do now is basically kind of like try to convert those bytes that will come from the request body and then try to store it into the request data kind of like space in memory. In this case, it's called a struct. The way you do that is basically using the JSON module. And then what you do is basically you need to have a decoder, right? Because these are bytes, they are coming through the protocol. They are simply bytes, but I know underlying of these bytes, there is a JSON. So I'm trying to decode these bytes onto a JSON. And the way things work in Go is basically with readers and writers, right? So the decoder is going to kind of like read its data from the reader, which is called body. In this case, it reads closer, so it will finish reading everything and then will close right away. So I'm going to basically, I'm just saying this, I want you to start decoding from the reader that is called read body. And then after this, I want you to decode onto a variable that I've made just now. And in this case, I'm just passing a reference to that variable request data. So what this line will do is basically is going to instantiate a decoder from the request body. So it's going to read from request body, try to decode it, and then basically decode whatever values of the request body and store that into the reference we've passed here, which is the request body variable itself. Now, this function can actually send an error if there is a problem with that decoding. So we need to check for errors here. So if error is not a nil, then we're going to just panic with that error. Cool. So what will happen now is that basically that request is going to come through. We're going to decode these bytes that we're getting through from the request body reader. We are decoding it into a variable called request data, and all of this is happening in one line. And then finally we are checking, that basically we don't have any errors. Cool, that's fantastic. Now, at this point in the program, if you've sent the right request, you should already see the right data in your request data object. I'm not going to go and do proper handling because that's just kind of a little bit more than what we want to do here. So just going for the very bare minimum at this point. Now, what I want to do is basically just send back the URL that the client will send for us. And the way I'm going to do this, we just did that earlier, so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to convert this this kind of like string that I'm going to get from request data. I'm going to basically just convert it back into bytes and then send it to the client as well as a response of that request. And that's about it. So again, let's just go through this. I'm going to instantiate a space in the memory using the shape that I've made. And then after that, I'm going to have a new decoder that's going to read from the reader code request.body, and it's going to decode these bytes values into the shape of the data that I just made, which is called request data. And then if there's an error, I'm going to panic. And then finally, I'm going to take the URL property, convert it into an array of bytes, and then send it back to the client. I hope that makes sense. Let's just run this and then see what happens when we make that request. Let me clear this, and then I'm going to make a request here. Again, this request is really simple here. I'm just making a request with this URL here, and I'm going to tag it with Golang. And this is a really nice article about how to like basics of Golang and so on. I am making, oopsie, let's not do that. I'm making simply a post request, and I'm attaching this data to it, and I'm making that request to the shorten basically route. If I send this, what I can see here is that basically I'm getting back this kind of URL that I sent in the beginning, right? And again, this is basically what I was speaking about here. This line makes space in the memory. This line will decode it, make a new decoder, decode it into that space in the memory, and then basically just send that back. And that's basically how you can have, you can kind of like accept JSON requests from the client and then send it back or do whatever you want with it. I'm going to stop here. This is just going to be the most simplest. I like that super relative stuff. It's basically, this is going to be the simplest way, the simplest HTTP server that you can have. A server that's listening on port 3000, and now you know how to handle basically a GET request. You know how to handle a GET request, and you also know how to handle a POST request. And that's the whole point of this video. In the next video, what we're going to do is we're actually going to start by deploying this right away. And it's extremely simple service. We're going to deploy it so you can get through an experience of making your own Docker file, deploying it. And then once we have a system that we have deployed, we know how it works, we know what's going on, we can start building on top of it and actually making it what we want it to be. Thank you for listening, and I will catch you in the next one.